And what I want to talk about is something I've taught in the past, but I don't think it's ever been taught here, and therefore it's not up on YouTube. And it's called Four Dimensions of Tefillah, Four Dimensions of Prayer. I don't like using the word prayer because the word prayer oftentimes has the idea of beseeching the divine. I prefer the word tefillah that has many more dimensions than what is usually evoked when we say the word prayer. So the first is I want to use two words that are used in Hasidic Judaism and differentiate between the two. Those are the first two levels. And the first one is hitbodedut. Boded is the Hebrew word to be alone. The word livoded means to insulate. So there's an idea where one goes into a state of consciousness where one is insulated from the outside world, but also insulated from what is happening within you. Now, this is definitely some kind of transcendental meditation. I think it's a very minor part of a full spiritual practice and a tefillah practice, but it's something we should try to achieve to still the inner life, to still the flow state into a kind of nothingness where consciousness is not apprehending something, but in a state of complete receptivity, but not receptivity to the world around us, and not even receptive to the thoughts that come up, the monkey mind that comes up and tries to intrude into consciousness. It is actually quite difficult. It's something to work on. It's nothing to worry about if you find it difficult, because I certainly found it difficult for years and still find it difficult at times. So here's the Kabbalistic idea. Once you empty the mind, the infinite of the divine cannot withstand a vacuum, as it were, which means what you're doing is you're creating space for the divine no thing, for the divine ayin, the divine nothingness to come in. It's so intriguing that one of the Kabbalistic words for the highest level of the Kabbalistic tree of life, which oftentimes goes under the label keter or crown, another name of it is ayin, aleph, yud, nun, which means nothing or no thing. So I find that just touching into that realm makes one's life of tefillah much deeper. The second level is hitbodedut, which for me is the core of every hitbonenut, which is the core of every spiritual practice. The word hitbonenut is from the Hebrew root bet yud nun, which is between, and it has a sense of discernment or differentiation. For example, the Hebrew word lehavin means to understand something or differentiate one thing from another. So lehitbonen means we take the capacity to reflect and to understand ourselves and turn it inward. This is the foundation of most of the spiritual practices that I teach, which means we're going into the higher self, but not to insulate ourselves from the inner life, but to be able to observe the inner life. Lahavin, to understand ourselves, differentiate among different ego states, and try to cultivate a consciousness within where the disruptive ego states are at peace, as it were, at least for the time being, and our positive ego states start to fill the field of consciousness. So I call that hitbonenut, reflection, contemplation. The third one, also taken from the Hasidic tradition, this is Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, has a book called Hishtapchut HaNefesh, which is the outpouring of the soul. Now, the outpouring of the soul, try to imagine, you've gotten to the center of your inner life. You can feel that you are, we say in Hebrew, upas, you are completely focused. It's like when you're shooting an arrow where you're all lined up, where you're looking at the weight scale and the line is on the zero. And you go to that place and you go to that spiritual center and you speak out the truest thing in your heart to the soul of the universe. Now, many people say, well, what if I don't believe in God? What if I don't believe in a personal God? It doesn't matter. Just imagine that the soul of the universe is completely tuned into you at that moment, and you have an opportunity to say, only for that moment, the truest thing in your heart in that moment. It is often words of grief. It is often words of deep longing for well-being for yourself or for other people. The times I've gone down there, sometimes the words that come out, I didn't even know were there. I was surprised by the core concern of my soul at that moment. It had been something I'd been avoiding or repressing. And it's always a revelatory moment, but it's also a deep moment of connecting to the divine. The fourth level is the actual words of the prayer book. And now, if we've accomplished a bit in hitbodedut, self-insulation, hitbonenut, contemplation, hishtapchuta nefesh, the ability to go to the core concerns of the soul, now when you open up a prayer book, you can engage in the Hasidic practice described in the Baal Shem Tov's Amud HaTfilah, which look at each word of the prayer book as an opening into an inner world of angels and souls and worlds, because you've opened up your own inner world. So many people, when they say, I have trouble with the prayer book, I have trouble praying, I lead people through this exercise, and another day I'll do a much lengthier guided journey, but I wanted to introduce this idea to those of you who may have not heard of it and might find this beneficial to your own spiritual practice. Okay, this concludes my Judaism 101 for today, and now I want to move on to my thoughts for Passover. First of all, this is, as I mentioned last night, Shabbat HaChodesh. This is the Sabbath in which announces that the month of Nisan is about to begin. If I'm not mistaken, it's Monday night, Tuesday. It will be the first of Nisan, which means 15 days later, or 14 days at night, Passover will begin. So this is your 2-week and 4-day alert that Passover is coming. So the rabbis instituted this idea, Parshat HaChodesh, I think simply to alert people that this is the beginning of the month of Nisan. Special Torah reading for today that we didn't do because we wanted to chant Shmini. But the Hasidic tradition has taken this special Sabbath, HaChodesh, and put it in the context of 3 other special Sabbaths to create a spiritual journey. Now, if you haven't studied Hasidic literature, you do not know that this spiritual journey exists. I've sometimes talked to very Orthodox rabbis, very learned, and I mentioned to them my spiritual practice of Arba Parshiot, and they say, never heard of it. Where'd you get this? I said, from Sfat Emet, from the Hasidic tradition. So there are people who are very learned, synagogue goers their whole life, who have never heard of this practice, and I want to make sure that you know it. Now, what are the Arba Parshiot? What are the 4 special portions? I don't want to talk today about where they came from, why they're in the calendar. For our purposes, they just are. So several weeks ago, the special portion was Parshat Shekalim. Whatever Torah portion was that day, in traditional synagogues, you read an extra little portion on the contributing of the half shekel. So the meditation is on the idea of halfness. And throughout my life and discussions with many other people, this idea of when I want to be counted in the census, I put a half shekel, not a full shekel. And so the question is, why does the Bible focus on halfness? We don't know. But the Hasidic tradition has some answers. I want to give you 3 brief responses. First of all, the half shekel was given to take partly for the purpose of a population survey, for a census. And this went through ancient times where Jewish communities needed to know how many active members of the community they have, and to participate in the census, you gave something like a half shekel. So the first meaning for me is, we are not whole unless we belong to a community of meaning. Now, it's certainly very sad for us that the community of meaning that we used to have that met in a physical place is no longer with us, but we certainly have this community of meaning here. But I would strongly recommend to everybody that you also have some kind of Torah study group, because a place where you can study and your thoughts, your understandings, your interpretations are reasoned through with other people who have the same interests as you. So not only do you have your opinion, you might be challenged about your opinion. Somebody might say, well, I don't read it that way, I read it this way. So from a Jewish tradition, a life full of meaning is always done bechevruta, in the presence of other people. It doesn't have to be a large group. In fact, it's probably preferable that it be 5 to 8 people, so everybody has a chance to talk. And you might say an ethos of Torah study is established. I'll say 2 brief words about that. What do I mean by an ethos of Torah study? In the ethos of Torah study, The point is not to put down the opinion of another person, to consider it and to add on to it. Oftentimes I've seen, I've certainly had it in my life, where I will give a talk and a person stands up and wants to point out the error of my thought, and I'm thinking to myself, great, you caught an error in my thought. Good for you. What the person could have done was say, fabulous talk. May I offer something to add on to something that you said? That certainly feels better for me and maybe even for the group. So if you ever have these kinds of groups, if you find that there's a person there who's the person who likes to take down other people, I would recommend that the group and the group leader say, that's not what we do here. You want to add something great, just don't rely on pointing out the deficiencies of others. A second thing in my ideal Torah study group is we are looking for meaning. And therefore, when we offer a thought, perhaps we've mastered my 4 levels of tefillah. There's a similar version for the study of Torah. But we train ourselves to look for the deeper meaning of the text, either encounter with your own soul through midrash or something else. So we are looking for the pashat, what the simple meaning is, assuming we can get at such a thing. We're also looking for something deeper. And a third thing I want to say, somewhat opposite of what I just said, is the text does actually have a meaning, which means it's more than what the meanings that it can bear. It probably made sense at a relatively prosaic level in its own time, which means the speakers of the language could understand what was being said. So sometimes when a person offers an interpretation, they say, well, that's just my opinion of what it means. I often say, as you know, let's look at the pashat first, meaning what does this text mean in the understanding of the Hebrew language, its place and time, before we go into midrashic depth. 3 little guidelines. I want to encourage everybody to have small group study in your life, not just Torah, but other things as well, and that there's certain ethos to be observed in those small groups. Another, which means, to put this in the terms of the half shekel, you're not a whole person if you're not reasoning about moral and spiritual things with other people. It's somewhat rare today to have communities, small communities of reasoning and meaning. It takes leadership, it takes work, it takes cultivation, but it's part of what fulfills us as a human being. Another meaning of shekalim for me is to know that I'm only in my flow state of consciousness, my regular self. This is only half of me. In fact, Jung would say it's a tiny part of me. Jung has a famous image where a person works in a bank, in a very, very huge bank, and says to his out-of-town family, come and see me at my bank. And for him, his bank is the reception window where he stands, and there's 30 stories up, which is also the bank, and 30 stories down from consciousness perspective. So always know that the self that is presenting to the world is oftentimes a cultivated, unconscious, but deliberate presentation of a persona, that which we put into the world, as with everybody else. Now, we have to have a persona that can operate in society, undoubtedly. But the problem is, we sometimes start to believe in our persona, the presentation of self in everyday society, and we don't take the time to say, okay, that's how I operate in the world. Different levels, in my close family, with friends, we have different levels of persona. But now you're alone with yourself, and there's a deep part of you that is not a whole human being by definition. No human being is a finished product. So I like to imagine that we have a whole self right over the horizon, and that I'm always working on within the intricacies and the complexities and the inner channels of the inner life. I'm always trying to work on it from spiritual and moral perspectives to come closer and closer to the self beyond the horizon. So the half shekel is, well, half of me is my persona. I'm checked in, I blocked the survey, present and accounted for. But the other part of me is the other half, as it were, that I'm working to bring into consciousness, and this is lifetime work. And as I mentioned yesterday, another meaning of the half. I'm sorry, I'll wait for this interpretation for later. The next of the Arba Parshio is called Parshat Zachor, which we read right before Purim, we remember Amalek, the nemesis of the people of Israel. And I believe there are still nemesis of Israel today, especially Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, etc. Very tragic thing. We have to deal with it. But I don't want us to forget our spiritual work. So from a Hasidic inner life perspective, Amalek is the destroyer within. And I talked about this a couple of weeks ago when I wanted to talk about the will. One of, I think, of the many great things about Roberto Assagioli's The Act of Will, and again, it's a superb book, the only deep exploration of the will that I know of. He does not fully address the will of the Yetzer Hara. He does not fully address the resistance to what you might say our conscious will toward what is spiritually and morally whole. There's actually a will toward destructiveness. Now, this is very different from the Aristotelian idea that evil is the absence of the good. Many people say that. It's also Maimonides and other places. If God is the origin of everything, God cannot be the origin of evil. So what is evil? The absence of the good, or meaning the absence of God. That's true to a point. But in the Hasidic tradition, in the Gnostic tradition, in the Kabbalistic tradition, evil is a conscious force. It has its own consciousness. Meaning, so that's, you say the Sitra Achra in general, I think sometimes takes over nations and cultures and groups of people. The inner experience of the Sitra Achra, the other side, the force of evil in the world, is the evil within us. Now, for most of us humble bourgeois people just trying to get through life, there might not be that much evil. We definitely have a Yetzer Hara, which means something in us that wills us to live contrary to our vision for ourselves. It's an inner Amalek. It's always at work. It's gnawing all the time. And how do you know when it's succeeding? When whatever your weakness is, whether it's anger, resentment, guilt, shame, fear, defensiveness, anxiety, however it breaks through, and we all know our usual suspects, it takes over, and that becomes who we are for some period of time. It's very painful. We look at parts of our lives and we say to ourselves, I was taken over by something destructive. I didn't invite it. It was not voluntary. I didn't will it. And I didn't know how to get out of it. We hear about this all the time. So one person said to me, I can't let go of my anger. And I oftentimes say, I think what you mean is, your anger is holding on to you. So it's as if in our conscious vision for ourselves, we've chosen to hold on to anger. That's not true, if that's your issue. Anger has a grip on you, and it does not want to let go. So whatever's going on, whatever plagues your inner life, in Shabbat Zachor, we meditate on, there's an active force for destructiveness, and on our way to the spiritual liberation of Passover, we have to have a deep understanding of our inner lives, an understanding of the Yetzer Hara, the resistance to our visions for ourselves, and the technology for breaking the grip of the Yetzer Hara and being able to live with, relatively speaking, freedom from the Yetzer Hara. You can never get rid of your Yetzer Hara. It will grab you at the most inopportune times. So we have to be skilled. I'm holding my hand like this because this is something we practice in jiu-jitsu. When someone grabs your lapel, how to break that grip. So every time I talk, I think about breaking the grip of the Yetzer Hara. I think about breaking the grip in judo and jiu-jitsu, and even in just regular self-defense. There's a grip, and there's a way to break the grip. There's a way to wear down the Yetzer Hara. It will try to re-grip. We have to always learn how to break the grip of the Yetzer Hara. So that's Shabbat Zachor. That's the second in our four-step path toward Pesach, toward spiritual liberation. The third is Parshat Parah, which is the Sabbath of the cow. By the way, just want to note, there's an excellent episode, forgetting the cartoon show just for a minute, South Park. South Park has an excellent episode on the red heifer, just in case you want a popular culture understanding of the so-called red heifer. So in Numbers chapter 14, there's an elaborate purification ritual using the Parah Adumah, a cow that is born entirely red. we put that aside. The deeper thing there is purity that I talked about just a moment ago. And it matches, in a way, the search for chametz in our homes, which for me stands for the searching for the inner chametz. Now, of course, this is similar to shekalim. This is similar to Amalek. But chatat, the Shabbat para, adds a little something to it to imagine yourself in a state of impurity. You might have to go back to times in your lives where you knew that something, again, it could be depression, it could be anger, anxiety, something in you made you lose your way entirely. And in looking back upon it, you realize that your will toward the good was absent or completely ineffective. You were taken over by some impurity. Now remember, at the time it made sense. At the time, something in your inner life says, well, this is the emotion, feeling that we have to let in. It wants to take over. Sometimes it's interpersonal, sometimes it's within you. So we go back to those moments and we try to reconstruct moments. And from my perspective, we ask ourselves, what in me, what ego self in me, what subpersonality in me needed to take over my system for what purpose? It's an inner life. And when people say, well, I did invite it, it was involuntary. From my perspective, something willed it. Something wanted you to go into, as it were, a negative mikvah, a bath of impurity. Something in you drove you there. So you can pick one thing per year where you had a moment of impurity and you want to be purified from it. So Shabbat Chatat goes into a deep sense of inner impurity, and we try to imagine ourselves needing a purification ritual from ritual impurity. Now, the fourth of the four special Shabbatot before Pesach is the one we have now, which Shabbat HaChodesh. I wrote about it in my Shabbat thought. I mentioned it last night. I'll just say it very briefly now, since I did cover it last night and in my Shabbat thought. And that is, we're looking at the dark side of the moon. I remember when I finally gained a basic understanding of the relationship of the sun to the moon and the earth. It was shocking to me. I never really thought about it, that when I look at the moon, let's say it's a half moon, let's say, right, this side is lit up. It means the earth is between the sun and the moon enough that the sun can only light up half the moon. So when I look at a half moon, I now know where the earth is in relationship to the sun and the moon. That might be obvious to everybody since second grade. It was not obvious to me until my adult life, where something I knew just never registered. And so as the moon goes through its cycles, I'm watching the moon, but I'm watching the moon in relationship to the earth and the sun. So when we get to the new month, it's a completely dark moon. Now, the dark side of the moon means that the moon is directly between the sun and the earth at night. The sun is, so no part of the moon is being lit up. So we are in a state of utter darkness. So in the Hasidic, and I'll focus on the Jungian tradition, is what do we do with this experience of utter darkness? Well, one thing I wrote in my Shabbat thought, I've been in the desert on a moonless night and also a starless night because of clouds, and it's a darkness that feels thick. We call it Choshech Mitzrayim, the darkness that was afflicted upon the Egyptians. It's suffocating. It feels terrible. But one thing I learned to do was you just sit down, you breathe, and you blink your eyes, and suddenly some kind of night vision kicks in, and you start to see shapes and forms. Some ancient part of ourselves, part of our evolutionary system, knew how to operate at night. We don't. We're rarely without light outside in some way. If there's no moon, there's stars. And learn how to navigate an utterly dark night. Well, you can see the analogy to the dark night of the soul. There's a great book by that name by a Christian author who I believe was descended from Kabbalists. So the dark night of the soul is not something that you just go through, and it's very painful, but there is a way to navigate the dark night of the soul. What you want to do is to learn how to navigate the dark night of the soul before you get there. And this is the thing I want to focus on today in the cause of spiritual liberation. One of the toughest things for us when we're not liberated is when we are in Hoshech Mitzrayim, that when we are in the plague of darkness, we can feel the darkness in us and surrounding us. And many people say, I don't know how to get out of it. I don't know what to do. And when you look in spiritual traditions, the Hasidic tradition and the Catholic tradition, I'm not so aware of other traditions, it's an expected part of the inner life. If you're experiencing the dark night of the soul, it's part of who you are as a human being, especially if you are a spiritually deep and sensitive human being. One of the prices we pay for being spiritually sentient people is we experience our own inner lives at an acute level. Grief is deep grief. Exhilaration is a whole different kind of exhilaration. So whatever emotions we have, I think if one is spiritually deep, especially the more painful ones, I think spiritually connected people feel the pain more sharply. That's been my experience in years and years of counseling people and knowing people. So the question is, what is it? Is there a way through it? And I believe it's something that is natural to spiritually connected people, that the dark night of the soul. There are skills of getting through it. What I want to do at this point is recommend it. So think of Parshat HaChodesh, starting today, which is the announcing of the new month. The actual new month is Monday night, Tuesday, which is the darkest day of the month of Nisan, meaning the first day. And for me, the idea is you can't get to the whole moon at Passover, spiritual liberation, if you don't know how to navigate the darkness. So in a way, it's a self-induced darkness. You say to yourself, you're middle age and beyond, I've been in dark places. I've had places where life was just completely without meaning, completely nihilistic. I don't know who I was, why I was here. I'm just phoning it in. I've got a persona. There's nothing behind the persona. You just feel empty and lost. And I assume you've all had those moments. And then you figure out, well, either you don't know how to get out and you learn later, or you start learning some skills to get out. You might get to a certain point in life where you actually are able to go through it more efficiently, and it doesn't plague you as much as when you were younger. I'm speaking autobiographically, and of course, many people here. But I think at this point, it's very important that we actually consciously go there. Consciously go there. Now, what do I mean by this? There are some times when I'm working on a talk or I'm preparing for Shabbat, and I have an idea what I want to work on. Before I come on a Friday night or a Saturday morning, or before I prepare a teaching or a piece of writing, I have to go there. Sometimes Meirav and I have a discussion. She said, well, as we're working out our Wisdom Works curriculum, for the rest of our lives, she said, this seems a little bit undeveloped. Could you give this some thought? And I say, okay. And come back next day, she says, wow, you really thought about it. Well, that's exactly right. I go to places in my inner life, you might say the unknown, meaning I have an idea that's just not fully thought out, and I have a practice of going there and finding darkness and finding resistance and going through it until, like sitting in the dark desert, you start to see shapes form. So I have found throughout my life, taking upon for myself intellectual problems, spiritual problems, emotional issues, deep psychological issues, is face them squarely and find your way through. Find your navigation system. Hopefully you've all developed these skills. If you're a younger person, I'll try to put these skills online as soon as possible. But for the spiritual liberation of Passover, it's an intentionally produced dark night of the soul, so you remember what the darkness is that the spiritual liberation of Passover is about. So to sum this up, We start with Shabbat Shekalim. I'm recommending a community of meaning, but at a more spiritual level, that whatever your persona is, there's another half of you, probably more than half of you, that's trying to figure out all of this and the intricacies of the inner life. And if we can connect the conscious life to the inner life, ma tov. It's a far better way to live. Secondly, recognize there actually is a nemesis within. There's an organized intelligence that does not want you to live according to your vision, that wants to foil all this work. It's always alive, it's always working, it's always active. This is some of the deficiency I see, for example, in Aristotelian ethics and the Rambam and others, including Roberto Assagioli. They don't seem to have a conscious idea of the Yetzer Hara, of the nemesis within. Third is the idea of purity. I would never have thought about this idea, by the way. I think the first two seem kind of a natural spirituality to me. I would have never tried to figure out the idea of purity had we not had Shabbat Parah. And I thought to myself, if I'm going to go through Shabbat Parah as one of the 4 Shabbatot before Pesach, I got to make sense of it. So what I had to do is, again, a self-induced sense of impurity where I really need a purification ritual. Now, you might not have that at this point in your life, but you might remember it. You might remember you worked it through informally. Well, Shabbat Parah for me is intentionally working it through as part of your path toward spiritual liberation at Passover. And then, of course, the 4th of the 4 Shabbatot is Shabbat HaChodesh, which for me this year is looking at the dark side of the moon, reflecting the dark night of the soul, again, recreating it within yourself, remembering or learning navigational tools to get us to the full moon of Passover. Shabbat Shekalim, Shabbat Zachor, Shabbat Parah, Shabbat HaChodesh. Okay, I'm doing this, Avigal, I'm going to ambush you a little bit here, but we have to get back to our regular practice where I'm going to invite your response. I hope you were reflecting and thinking about this as I was talking, because I always enjoy what you have